Okay, good. All right. So we went through interlanguage processing, processability theory, information restructuring, destabilization, and U-shaped learning. Consider that to be one kind of job lot. That's the 80s and 90s. That's sort of the lot that I was in on, right? And then more recent constructs that have come from psychology, working memory, and attention, which is now where we're getting all these experimental studies that look like psych. Okay. And finally, most recently, as you'll see, for example, if you look at dynamic systems on page 280, you only just have to look at the publication dates to see where we are. Like Larson-Freeman 2012, Larson-Freeman and LS 2006. I mean, you can see you're at the sort of end game of what's happening now. She's done a lot of work with adaptive systems and so on. This is all becoming a new thing. All right, so we've actually only got a little bit to go, but so to sort of round this off, it's the idea that if there's no specialist architecture, so if there's no magic box, as Diego says, what do we have? And it turns out we have got that. We're now going to talk about it in terms of the general cognition processes that we talk about, all knowledge, right? How we learn all things. So, and these have been now used in SLA the same as they're used in everything else. So one thing is, for example, declarative versus procedural knowledge. So declarative knowledge is to know about something. Procedural knowledge is to know how to do something. So the idea is that the farther your procedural knowledge goes, it becomes more and more automatic. Okay. So in your book, they talk about it in terms of learning to play tennis or something else. So first of all, you learn about it, then you learn how to do it. Like, you can't learn, I don't know if they use this example, but it's an example that's used quite a lot. You can't learn how to hit in tennis until you actually start trying to hit, right? You can learn about it, but you can't feel what's the correct way to hit a fabulous whatever it is. In tennis, I don't know, I don't play tennis, until you learn to do it, right? And then the better you get at it, by the time you're, what's her name? Venus Williams, it's completely automatized, right? She doesn't think about it at all. She knows how to do it. And it applies the same across so the idea literally is that we're doing the exact same thing as second language learners. We start with something declarative, move towards procedural, and by the time you get to what Krashen would call acquisition, the stuff you can use really well, that's now automatized, right? But do you remember what Krashen said about the brain, about the learning and the acquisition?
They don't share.
They don't share, right? This is super important, right? I told you about the garden. I always talk about it as a garden wall, right? There's a garden wall in between the brain. If you learn something, you can learn it, but you can't then acquire it. And if you acquire something, that's the only stuff that you can use without the monitor, right? So what this says is entirely different. It says that knowledge goes through the brain. It starts as one thing, and then it develops into another thing, and then it develops into automatized knowledge. So in other words, the more inaccessible something is, the more the less procedural it is, the less automatized it is, the more you have to rely on declarative knowledge. And declarative knowledge is the thing where you have to think about it, right? So again, we're at this thing of, it's the same idea that there's some knowledge that you can just, some language that you can just use, and some that you have to think about, but it's completely different from the concept that Krashen had of how that works. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. There's also the idea of implicit versus explicit learning. Again, something out of learning theory and psychology. Input processing without explicit consciousness versus more conscious operations. So again, this idea of implicit is more like procedural and explicit is more like, declarative. And the third one they talk about, representation versus control. Again, it's the same idea. It's not exactly the same idea. They're all sort of theoretically slightly different, but the main important thing that you need to know, or you need to remember, is that this is a general psycholinguistic way of looking at how knowledge is organized in the brain, that applies to language in the same way that it applies to everything else. Yes? Okay, so it turned out I was nearly finished anyway. So finally, interface of knowledge types. So there's the no interface position, which would be Krashen's position, right? That half your brain is doing one thing and half your brain is doing something else, which we're just going to abandon. There's the weak interface position. So if implicit knowledge fails, we call on explicit knowledge, right? So if our procedural understanding of what's going on fails, we call on our declarative, to try and learn about something rather than actually do it. And the strong interface position, which is that it gets moved, information gets moved through. Starts declarative, becomes procedural, ultimately becomes automatized, the same way that it does with any other learning skill that we might choose to do. Yeah? Okay, then in that case, have a look at page 288 and 289. And tell me that you understand all these points. Or if you don't understand them, which ones you don't. Don't worry about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We didn't talk a lot about different kinds of input processing. So don't worry about that. We don't need that. You also don't need the last but one. We didn't talk about the competition model, and that's also fine. We don't need to do all that. Thumbs up. Almost. Plowing through. Take your time, Mark. We've got time. Okay. So that's about 40 odd years worth of psycholinguistic processing work in 30 pages. So that's a lot. And I don't expect you, that's why I'm saying there's certain models we don't need to deal with and certain things. If you go on to do a more advanced seminar in SLA, or if you go on to do more advanced work in SLA, you'd have to start teasing apart some of these individual models to decide what it is you were interested in. But it's just to give you a general idea of, in the same way as we looked last week at how individual differences have expanded, you know, to include now personality types, individual learning methods, whatever. So psycholinguistics has expanded to now add more and more finding from psychology and so on. If you want to have a crack at a psycholinguistic priming test, if you go to page 292, there is a link. And if you go to that link, it gives you a practice priming test, the kind of thing that psycholinguistic experimenters ask little undergraduates to do all the time. So that's sort of a fun, if you want to have a go at it. For your reading post, I want you to go ahead and complete number 3 on page 290, which will be super easy for you to do because it's a miniature data analysis and you've already done 2. Okay, and it's super more easy, Diego, than the other. Yeah, it's like, yeah, the last one was tough because the last one needed you to think very carefully. You sort of had to think around it. It needed you to think very carefully about the difference between temporal adverbs, so semantic meaning, and core syntactic meaning, and how that might be interacting. But as long as you got the general idea that you were looking at the difference between learners who just couldn't work out the core meaning of tenses and how that attached to a temporal adverb. And the other thing that was important to get was this idea that they specifically say to you, there's a Spanish sentence here that is correct in Spanish, right? But these learners judged it as incorrect in English, which means that they're obviously not beginning all the time from their L1. And in this case, the universal semantics of temporal adverbs seem much more important than anything that they
carried over.
Yeah, than anything they carried over. They were like, this just can't, this doesn't make any sort of universal sense, you know. So if you had those things, which most people had some version of that, then now I want to say that the third one is not as difficult. I want to say that because I don't think it is. But do yourselves a favor. The third one is based on chapter 12, input, output, and interaction in SLA. So the best thing that you can do to prep for the third one is to make sure that you've read that chapter before we go over it next week, and that you're clear on what that's talking about, and you give me, you have questions for me if you know, and so on, like prior to coming in, and then I'll give you this one and you'll have a week to do it. But it's based on this idea of input, interaction, and output. So yeah, have a read of that before you come in for sure. That's it. I'm done. Questions, comments, issues?
So that's reading post number 3. Is there anything else to do next week?
Yes, your thing is due on the 16th. Your proposal.
Annotated bibliography.
Yeah, annotated bibliography proposal is due on the 16th.
Okay.
Yeah. I gave you a couple of weeks, but I realise I'm making people really confused because now a bunch of people thought it was due this week.
It was at the beginning of the lecture last week.
I said it's due next week.
Right, and that's what confused people because I actually had a conversation with
I'm so sorry, that was entirely my fault.
yeah, it's all right. Well, I had a conversation with somebody who's in the online section I'm friends with,
Right.
and she was texting me last night. She's like, "Oh my god!"
Was that not due today?
No.
No. But if you want and you turned it in today, I can give you some feedback and then you can turn it in. If it's not an A, you can turn it back in next week for a
that'd be
full-blown A.
Yeah. I knew
That's
that.
what I'm going to do with Tolupe. So I think you're absolutely right, Mark. That was entirely my fault.
That's it was Shannon. I'm friends with Shannon Geary,
Ah,
and she was like,
yeah.
"Oh my god!" And I'm just like, I don't even have a topic yet.
Yeah, right. No.
It's not due till
not
next
due
week.
till the 16th.
I mean, I'm totally complacent with the fact that I don't even have a topic. So.
That's so much better.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I think that's entirely my fault then.
Well, but I
On the
told her,
syllabus, it says.
and that's what I told her. I was just like, look at the syllabus. You're fine.
Yeah. But maybe I've messed everything up for everybody. Wouldn't be the first time.
It's okay.
But if you've put it in there, Diego, and you want, let me take a look at it. I'm also going to have a look at Tolupe's. Let me take a look, and I'll give you some feedback, and then you can clear it up and get an A+ next week.
Great. Yeah,
How's
just think
that?
how far ahead y'all are.
Yeah, just think how far ahead you all are. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Don't think about that night that you stayed up all night 2-3 days ago. Just think about how far ahead you are. Thank you, everybody. You are done.
All right.
I am still here if anybody needs to